Well, good afternoon and welcome to this CCMA webinar on marriage in a hookup culture. We're pleased to have with us today Timothy O'Malley. Timothy O'Malley is an academic director of the Notre Dame Center of Liturgy in McGrath Institute for Church Life. He also serves as the director of education at the McGrath Institute, where he develops theological and pastoral curricula for youth ministers and catechists and liturgical ministers. He is a theologian at the University of Notre Dame and author, most recently, of the book God, Love, Dating, and Marriage in a Hookup World, which is available through Ave Maria Press. He's married to Cara O'Malley and has two young kids. And so I'd like to welcome and introduce to you Timothy O'Malley. Take it away, Tim.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm sitting here actually in Florida drinking LaCroix, key lime, on my own spring break. Like many of your students, I'm on spring break, though I imagine mine is somewhat distinct from the 6 and 2-year-old I have with me than many of your students. So it's great to be here with you and to speak a little bit about my book, Off the Hook, God, Love, Dating, and Marriage in a Hookup World, which came forth happily, first and foremost, not from even Notre Dame and a course I teach here, although it's part of a marriage course I teach at Notre Dame, but actually it came forth, most importantly, from work with Katie Diller from Michigan State, who was the first person who ever asked me to speak on the sacrament of marriage at Michigan State. So I'm really grateful to Katie, who I think is most responsible for this book. Many of you know her, and you should praise her to the nth degree. I want to start with the heart of my book and sort of describe some of the dimensions of how we can sort of speak about hooking up with many of our students and how to attract a kind of different imagination for things. This is, of course, is an image of my wife and myself watching a Notre Dame game during the few times we can escape from our children with joy. You know, we grew up with a certain conception of love, my wife and I, and a hope of certain understanding of love. We imagined that in essence, we'd fall in love, we'd have kids, everything would go perfectly according to plan. And of course, it didn't. You know, my wife and I struggled to have children. We adopted our two children. And in a lot of ways, we struggled. We had a kind of myth of what constituted love, which undoubtedly many of the students you work with do, because they grow up in the myths of romantic comedies, right? Romantic comedies that say everything always turns out perfect. And I think the heart of our marriage was figuring out this statement from St. Paul: I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. That the heart of the sacrament of marriage is this offering of this love, of our very bodies in love, not just, of course, sexually, but every dimension of our lives. Now, this notion of love butts up against the myths of love. And I think in the hookup culture, we're in a new myth of love. It's a new myth of love. And so what is this culture and how does it work? My own book relies early on by the work of Donna Freitas, who many of you know. The End of Sex is one of the books I've had my students read. And she describes the nature of the hookup. So if the myth in my wife and I was a sort of myth of endless progress leading to the greatest joy in our lives, the myth that many of our students begin their dating careers with today is the hookup. And the hookup, as I always explain to priests and religious who always say, like, oh, well, people have always had premarital sex. It's not premarital sex. This is a different sort of interaction, of sexual interaction. Freitas writes in her book, The End of Sex, for all intents and purposes, the hookup has replaced the first date on campus. People are more likely to meet each other randomly in the dark, kissing one another, or doing something else. The hookup is an intentionally ambiguous term that can mean anything. When you encounter college couples today, chances are they got into their committed relationship through a hookup. This also means it's likely they had sex before they went out on a date or had a serious conversation about their feelings for each other, if they even knew each other's name. And it almost certainly means that the couple engaged in many drunken encounters before ever becoming sexually intimate while sober. In this culture, the sex comes first, then openness and communication, but only much later. So really the heart of the hookup, I think a lot of the emphasis in the church in the last several years around premarital sex has been on a certain interpretation of theology of the body, which says like, well, the main thing is we need to get people to understand the heart of sex. Fair enough. But actually the hookup isn't really about sex. It's about a fear of communion, a fear of authentic communication with someone, to enter into a relationship with someone where there's something more than sexual titillation, but that there's real friendship, real communion that extends beyond a 15-second encounter. And of course, where does this come from? Well, I mean, we could look at Tinder. You know, I was at DePaul recently, meeting with students and meeting with a campus minister there. And they were describing how many people get on Tinder because they're looking for someone to tell them they matter, looking for someone to swipe left or right. I never remember which one, the one that means you're hot versus not hot. So they swipe left or right in order to sort of communicate to the person that they're beloved and loved. The smartphone itself is a lack of communion. I look at my students before class, and almost all of them are gazing at a device, not looking at each other, not talking to one another, not introducing themselves to one another, but sort of all communication occurs through the smartphone, which in essence becomes a kind of replacement for a conversation, for real acts of love. And of course, this is most exacerbated by pornography. My book talks about the endemic of porn. You know, I estimate at Notre Dame, amongst 8,000 undergraduates that we have, with around 4,000 being male, around 1,200 will look at porn per day. That's a crazy number. 1,200 men in particular, though women are also looking at porn, are gazing at porn and engaging in essence, sexual encounters devoid of a real enfleshed human being. All of this comes to make up the hookup culture, a real fear of communion. You know what? It even affects those who don't hook up. You know, Jason King, in a recent book, who wrote, he's a professor at King's in Wilkes-Barre, notes that only around 20% of Catholic students, at least on Catholic campuses, will hook up. And undoubtedly, those of you who are involved in other forms of campus ministry, whether at Newman Centers or at parishes that minister to colleges, encounter lots of those who don't hook up. But still, it has an effect on it. It has an effect on them. I write in my book, even those who do not participate in the hookup culture are affected by the cheapening of sex in the dating market. They grow up watching television and films in which it's normative for young, attractive men and women to engage in sex soon after meeting, second, third date. You know, this is not sort of the sitcoms that I grew up with, in which at the end of the night, the married couple might engage in sex, but you know, with the lights off and the screen would go black. This is a culture that grows up where it's normative to meet and have sex early on. In fact, it's considered weird if you don't. I had a good friend of mine who was out on a third date, and the guy said to her, you know, we don't have to have sex. Or sorry, she was out on the second date. We don't have to have sex on the third date. She said, I know, I wasn't going to. And so this is the kind of thing that it becomes normative, even affecting those who don't hook up. They hear about friends who've participated in drunken hookups and who have parlayed such hookups into long-term relationships. These relationships really do sometimes become long-term. They're not necessarily just 15-minute events. Hookups can become long-term, and in fact, that's the normal way that many undergraduates today enter into relationships with one another. When they go out on the date, it's likely that the person on the other side of the table expects easy access to sex early in the relationship. So as I noted, a friend of mine recently heard on a date, we don't have to have sex on the third date. And so this becomes the kind of zone in which many people are engaging in the act of dating and love. And it's what I've discovered amongst my undergraduates. I teach 150 per semester. And amongst the 150, they all have experience with this misery. So why can marriage help? It may seem odd, right? Like to say like, okay, let's talk about marriage with people who are hooking up. You know, all numbers tell us that marriage has dropped significantly in the last number of years. But actually, liturgies and sacraments matter to Catholics in particular because the question isn't whether we worship, it's what we worship. I'll repeat that again. It's not whether we worship, it's what we worship. It's what we love, right? And so in a culture that hooks up, there's a liturgy to it. There is an anti-liturgy to it, but there is a liturgy to it. And it is a form of worship, of loving something in particular. And so the medicine that I recommend is serious discussion of what real love is, of what love in the sacrament is. James K. Smith, a philosopher at Calvin College, writes, "Love is a habit. This means that our love is like second nature. It directs and propels us, often under the radar of conscious awareness, like breathing and blinking. Our loves acquire direction and orientation because we're immersed over time in practices and rituals that affectively and viscerally train our desires." So the hookup culture trains desires, and if we want to train new desires, we need practices that are distinct that train these desires. And so I want to talk a little bit about marriage as one of these, which is basically the theme of my book, and then we'll call it a day and answer questions. You know, one of the things that I think we really, my undergraduates are affected with is a misunderstanding of what constitutes love. They think love, even if they don't want to admit it, is what they find in a romantic comedy. It's 10 things I hate about you, or how to lose a guy in 10 days. They think love is this consuming desire in which you'll meet someone and your whole existence will be taken over. I've talked to a number of students and even peers and faculty and staff who say like, well, you know, I went on a date and I haven't experienced anything yet. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? How many dates? Well, I've been on one date. Yeah, well, that's normal because you don't know the person and you don't care about them yet because you've had like a 2.5-hour meeting. They expect this sort of communion of love that will like transform their existence and meet every need that they've ever had in their entire life. I've been married for 13 years. The one thing I realized very early on, my wife realized it earlier than I, is that we will not complete each other. And so one of the things we do is need to get them to reflect on a philosophy of love, to really think about what constitutes love. One of the ways I do this with my students right now is this book by Eva Illouz called Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love and the Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, in which it argues that, you know, our understanding of love and marriage is linked to a series of practices that are designed to get us to buy stuff. And they're get us to think that like this consuming romantic desire that we have, in which is perfect in love that like has nothing but gazing into one another's eyes without children, for example, vomiting on hotel floors. This sense of love is presumed to be the normal one. So the new marriage attempted to integrate an emerging therapeutic discourse that this love would complete me, transform me, fix all my problems, and it borrowed social and scientific medical models to explain and ease troubled marriage. The new ideal attempted to combine attitudes and activities not otherwise reconciled. To be successful, a couple now had to combine spontaneity and calculation, right? We do the craziest things together that we plan. The ability to negotiate with a taste for hot romance, right? So like we have to fight and engage in energy and discourse while also making sure the bills are paid. So this is the philosophy of love that Illouz diagnoses that many students are affected with. And the hookup is a kind of medicine for this because they're not ready for this weird sort of love that you have to have like perfect sort of marriages while you're combined with like spontaneity. And so they decide that they just need to hook up for a while until they're ready for something that's real. That's why so many undergraduates will describe the initial hookup that they have as just getting it out of the way so that they can really engage in this extraordinary complicated search for love. Of course, that's not love. Love, I think, as I described to my students, is that which gives us sight, revealing to us even the faults of the other and their full import, and causing us to suffer because of them. Love reveals to us intuitively the whole being of the other in a mysteriously lucid unity. It shows us individual praiseworthy traits, but also the particular charm of his, her individuality as a whole. When we love, what we see is the other person as gift. We see them in their particularities, in their odd particularities, right? When I love my wife, I don't mind that she chews her cereal loudly. She does. Or that I leave socks on the floor when I get home. I do. Like right away on the floor, like in the living room, not like in a special place, right in the living room. These things we see, but we see the person, and we seek to share our life with this other person, which is the driving force of love. It's the love of this person. It's not about an experience that transforms me alone. It's the manner in which I lift up this person as gift. And so, that leads to number 2, which is the practice of dating for many of our students is just destroyed. A good friend of mine at Carrie Cronin at Boston College is very famous for assigning a dating assignment. One of the reasons she does is because our students expect that dating will they'll sort of like meet someone, look them in the eyes, and then everything will come immediately. They don't recognize that sometimes you have to go out on a date with someone, really share life with them, learn to have normal human conversations, look them in the eyes, understand dating as a practice where you ask them things like, hey, what's your name? You have siblings. What was it like to grow up with those siblings? These are the kinds of conversations that are in a hookup culture infected by technology that our students are not used to having. So to enforce our students to go on dates, normal dates, where at the end they don't plan on getting married immediately, is essential. The other medicine is to link very closely to the scriptures, right? So this is a natural dimension. The sacrament of marriage and love in the tradition is natural. No one had to think it up. No one had to create it. It's not like the Eucharist, where it is a sort of natural or cosmic dimension, but it's linked so closely to what Christ did at the Last Supper. But with marriage, people get married whether the church marries them or not. And so we have to give the narrative of what love is. And so I introduce my students often to Ephesians. This is a complicated text, so I'm always very wary of doing so. But in Ephesians, we, specifically Ephesians 12, this sort of great sort of description of marriage, or rather Ephesians 5, my apologies. Be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. This is the heart of Christian life. It's the self-gift. It's not about power. It's not about who has control. It's about self-gift. And so at the heart of Christian marriage is actually defeating this narrative of who's in control, who has power, who can master one another. And so even a passage like Ephesians 5, 1 through 2, 21 through 33 is really about this self-sacrificial love. We hear Paul say, be subject to one another out of reverence to Christ. Both be subject to one another out of reverence to Christ. Give up this search for power, prestige, grasping fame. And so even the text where it gets into these sort of descriptions of gender roles isn't intended to actually say, wives, be sort of subject to your husbands in a way reduced to being owned by them. Rather, this is a charisma at the heart of the church that describes what the sacrament of marriage is. It's the reason that in the 12th century marriage became a sacrament. It's because monks reflected on this text and saw the possibilities of what love could be, natural love as it's lifted up in Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. While my wife and I joke when we hear this passage in church, in reality, you can't stop there. For as the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. the passage continues. But the heart of the passage is that both husband and wife have to give up this desire of seeking power, of seeking an understanding of love as reducible to sort of completing themselves, and rather to see love, natural love, is dedicated to one thing and to one thing alone: the flourishing of the other, the salvation of the other. That in marriage, we see that at the heart of why marriage is a sacrament is because Christ gave himself totally in love. And therefore, husband and wife are to learn this narrative of love, not seeking a lack of communion, but the greatest communion that becomes possible through Christ. I'll skip this one, but this is linked to the liturgy of marriage itself. This is what's most attractive to my students. They think love, and they learn this from Hooking Up, is about a lack of communion. It's about a power game, and about one has control, and who has control, and who knows whose name, and who doesn't know whose name, and how we don't get too close. But in marriage, what they're most attractive to hearing, that the heart of marriage is a yes. I recommend this book to everyone involved in working with undergraduates. It's Cardinal Ouellette's Mystery and Sacrament of Love, a Theology of Marriage and the Family for the New Evangelization. But in this text, he writes, the mutual yes expressed verbally in liturgical language is translated into the language of the body. That is to say, not only into the conjugal encounter, right? I think so many people think marriage is licensed to have whatever sex you want. But the heart of marriage is, I, Tim, take you, Kara. Of course, you could insert your own names. You shouldn't use those unless your wife is named Kara and you're named Tim. I, Tim, take you, Kara, to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you, to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. I will love you and will honor you all the days of my life. In this exchange, I give myself in fullness to the other person. I express the radical hope for communion, and the other person expresses this back. Of course, sex is part of this, but it's not the only thing, right? Consummation is part of this. But it's linked, as Ouellette notes, to the spouse's shared life, their fidelity, friendship, forgiveness, fecundity, education, etc. The sign prolongs itself enriched by the redemptive power of Christ and the salvific action of the church. It establishes the couple as a permanent sacrament and transforms its history into salvation history. Dear friends, we may be shocked to hear this, but the students we work with are very happy to learn that the love that they share in the most mundane of ways, the love that they recognize is mundane, right? Any couple who's dated for more than 15 minutes knows that a heart of marriage and love is mundane. I knew my spouse loved me. We weren't married yet, but when she came over and fed me ice cubes after I had a terrible stomach illness, and I was this sort of pathetic shell of a self, and my wife came over, and of course my sickness was very dramatic, as all sicknesses for me are. And my wife came over and she gave herself to this act of giving me ice cubes, despite the fact that she could get sick from this. She gave this ice cube to me every 10 minutes as a kind of mundane act of rehydrating my rather sort of eviscerated, like myself that was emptied of everything. This such natural dimension of love, this communion that we long for, is the place that God has decided to save the human family. What a gift. And that you'd be surprised the number of college students who hear about consent in marriage and are suddenly excited by it. That it's not just about sex. They don't just want sex, even sanctified sex. What they really want is to have someone there to take out the trash. And that is, for me, the kind of Eucharistic nature of married love. This is the heart of this. This is a preface that's prayed at the Eucharistic prayer for marriage that my students are very attracted to. For in him you've made a new covenant with your people, so that as you've redeemed man and woman by the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection, so in Christ you might make them partakers of divine nature, so in Christ, or in joint heirs with him of heavenly glory. In the union of husband and wife, you give a sign of Christ's loving gift of grace, so that the sacrament we celebrate might draw us back more deeply into the wondrous design of your love. This sacrament of love, this sacrament of the Eucharist and of marriage, is the normal mundane way that families sanctify this communion. Marriage in the end and sex is dedicated not to some endless titillation, but to the gift of children, to the gift of a family, to adopting kids if you're not able to have kids, to if you're not able to have kids but you still share your life in your work so that everything you do becomes a sign of this communion. This is far more attractive than an endless living out of vacations, of remarkable sexual acts in which there's total sort of like desire, but not this deeper sense of communion in which the world is transformed. My students are pleased as heck to realize that at the heart of marriage is self-giving love, and that they receive this self-giving love from Christ and then offer it in return. That's linked, of course, to medicine number 6 for this hookup culture, which is the domestic church. I love to have my students, whether they're Catholic or not, come over to my home and see my family, because so many of them have created an understanding of love in marriage that's apart from the mundaneness of putting kids to bed. Love is transformed when you see a married couple put their kid to bed, or not put their kid to bed because it takes forever, reading stories, praying together, suddenly seeing the way that something so joyful, right, as hanging out with your kids can be transformed in love. The family becomes an icon of the church, with the love of Christ dwelling among mortals. It does so through sustaining memory. It teaches sacrifice. It sustains the memory of this family, but of the memory of the church. It teaches what real sacrifice is and brings each person into communion. Every family has a vocation drawn from the Eucharist, and therefore the family is the orientation of marriage. We have to get our undergraduates thinking about family life much sooner. This is very hard because many of us attend institutions that at the end, no matter you're talking about a public institution, a private institution, a Catholic institution, or a secular institution, the one thing they want to say is our students will change the world, but they won't include that they'll raise kids. And there is nothing more integral to authentic communion than raising kids with another person, of participating in a project that's well outside of one's own work, of own self. And so those are the medicines, and that's my presentation. This is a kind of very quick synopsis of the book, but we have a chance for conversation for the rest of our time together to answer some particular questions. So thanks so much for joining up with the webinar.
All right, thank you, Timothy. If you have any questions, you can either send them over in the chat box, or if you'd like, you can just ask me to open up your microphone. Or if you are able to do so and know how to do it, you can unlock your own microphone. So why don't you just take a moment if you'd like to let me know if you'd like your microphone opened, and we'll start to entertain questions. I always like to hum the Jeopardy theme as we wait. I see somebody. Cindy, are you trying to speak here? I'll unmute. Cindy, were you trying to say something there? I guess not. Okay. Any other questions? Any questions, or anybody like the microphone open? I think we're just all going to read the book, right? It's all there. Anybody?
Yeah, you can also email me or bother me on Twitter, or you can show up at my office. You can send me a pigeon of some sort with a telegram. I'm also accessible in all those ways.
Bottle in the water won't work, I assume, in where you are. But
the bottle of water? Well, it would. I'm in Florida right now, so I would get it. Probably not soon.
Okay, that's right. You are in Florida. All right, keep rubbing it in. All right, Michael, did you have a question?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Tim, thank you so much just for giving us what I know is a very, very brief synopsis of the book, and probably feels like, the NASCAR version through it. But I think we got the overhead view of it. A question I would have is, as you present a lot of the positive reactions to students in terms of marriage and giving sort of this counter vision to hookup culture, what are some of the pushbacks that you get, though, in the first few weeks as you present this? Because I'm sure not all of them are easily persuaded, at least right off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very few students who like the hookup culture, pure and simple. I'll get, in a class of 150, I'll have 3 to 5 that will say, like, well, this is just the new norm. This is what the church and society needs to advance. What I'm actually most shocked by is how many don't like it and actually prefer normal sort of dating practices and are pleased as heck that someone has finally allowed them to do so. I've had Roman Catholics who will say, who will be engaged in a relationship that they feel very uncomfortable sexually active in, write to me saying, like, this class was finally the thing that allowed me to turn that around. Now we're not engaged in love. I'll have guys, bros, or as I call it, bro town, which is a sort of 2 rows in the back of the class. They'll be the ones who come to me during office hours and say, I've been hooking up with this girl for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and this class has made me really uncomfortable, and I realize I love her, and I kind of want to figure out what I want to do to move this from sex to love. And what I'm most shocked is actually by the number of people who don't have pushbacks. And when they have pushbacks, their pushbacks are things like, well, the church is just behind the times, and this is just the new norm. And so they're very open. This is just their presumption. But it's so few. Even my atheist students, right? This is a required theology course at Notre Dame. My atheist students will say things like, man, I hated this, and I'm glad that you gave a chance for me to reflect why I hated this. And so I actually just find most undergraduates don't like this. This is the secret of often cultural scripts that undergraduates are given, is they don't like the script that they've been given, but they live it out anyway, even though they don't like it, because they think it's the only script that they can have.
Thanks, Tim.
Great. Joanne has a question, Timothy. It says, it sounds like you teach this in a class, but how might a campus minister include this in programming?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the ways to include it in programming is, number one, like to have the conversations. You don't need to do this in a class. And my class is very conversational. I'll begin with 15 to 20 minutes around major questions around a theme. So, 28 classes per semester, and each one of them will take up something like, why do you think hooking up is a big deal? Like, to sort of even open up that conversation is extraordinary. When I was at DePaul, I was just meeting with them, and they love to talk with one another about what's going on and why they think it's going on and what's wrong with it. And so even by opening up spaces of conversation around hooking up, I think actually does a lot. And so you don't need to have a full class. Really, just even by sort of talking about it 3-4 times over the course of a semester in particular kinds of ways, whether you have a presenter who comes in and speaks on what's the sacrament of marriage and what is it and how does it work, to speak very honestly about what constitutes a hookup and to lead a conversation, that can be enough. And so you don't need a full class for this. Though I think in my book, I suggest practices that you can also engage in. I do think that encouraging students to go out on dates is not an unimportant thing, and actually fostering a dating culture can be quite essential too. This doesn't mean that you get people to go out on dates right away and that's the only thing they do, but that they come to recognize that dating is normal, and that on the first date, you don't normally marry the person you're with, which is a lot of the Catholics presume this. And that's why they hook up, is they think dating is about just getting married after 15 seconds. Or to really learn those practices of communion and communication that will enable flourishing. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can integrate that into programs. You don't need a class, though I'm happy to send you any, if anyone emails me a syllabus or lecture notes or anything like that, that would help you.
Right. Question here from Mike. How can we encourage our priests and deacons to preach about this? And is this too complex to offer in homilies, or should it be unpacked in a different format?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the context. I mean, a 10 o'clock evening mass with mainly undergraduates is very different than a 10 a.m. mass with like families too. This is not the kind of thing I talk about with like 9-year-olds. And so I think one of the things we do have to get priests and deacons recognizing this. Every time I talk to a priest, a bishop, or a deacon on themes related to hooking up, they think that they are so utterly scandalized at the end that this is happening. They have no awareness. And so they're often very shocked. I'm not saying every priest, deacon, and bishop is shocked, but every conversation I've had with them is they have no idea so much of this is going on. And so, the best that we can do, I'm not sure if homilies are always the best place for it, but I do think that our pastoral ministers, especially those working with young people, need to recognize that we're in a different age than even like 15 years ago. And if you recognize that, then, it's not enough to just speak about the sacrality of sexuality, but we have to sort of actually deal with a longing for communion that is not being met, whether it's sexual or not. There's a sort of communion. Many of my most conservative students who would never hook up are incapable of having a face-to-face conversation with anyone. This is what the hookup culture promotes. It's a lack of communication, whether it's sexual or not. And so I think we have to sort of underline the state of the world as it is. I do that in my first chapter in the book, trying not to be too salacious, but also being fairly realistic.
Good, thank you. Edward has a question, but I'm dialed into audio via my phone. If I unmute myself, will I be able to speak? Yes, Edward, you can, and I should be able to unmute you also. So just give me one sec. Oh, I don't see you as muted. So, Edward, why don't you go ahead and try? Not hearing. So if you'd like to type that question in or unmute yourself, feel free. Joanne said thank you to your response. Any other questions? As we wait, Edward's going to type it. So as we wait for him, anybody else have any questions that they'd like to pose? Okay, then we'll just wait for Edward's question. Okay, Edward said it's related to the pornography issue. You mentioned 1,200 a day at Notre Dame. How do we address this?
I've tried 2 ways, and the 2 ways I've tried it have revealed to me that one of them is better than the other. The first is to be very direct. And I think this is actually deeply uncomfortable for people because there's a good deal of shame with pornography. I think even those who laugh it off are aware that it's something that's that they shouldn't be doing, but that they are doing. And so directness, like in very public settings, can be really problematic. I think one-on-one conversations are quite essential, and support groups are essential. The number of men I meet per semester, and I work primarily with men on this issue because I'm male, and so they come to me, though I know increasingly a larger number of women are looking at porn, is that they need support groups to really have conversations with them. They need sort of discipline that can help them get out of it. And so, yeah, we have to sort of speak out against it, but we have to recognize that a lot of this are targeted. When I talk to my students who become addicted to porn early on, they'll say things like, I was like 7th grade, I was looking up dinosaurs or whatever, and then suddenly this ad popped up, and then suddenly I was on a porn site. They're targeted. They look for 7th graders. It's a malicious form of advertising that gets these 7th graders addicted to pornography. And so I think we often need to sort of deal in support groups to help men and women alike to deal with this. And so, to me, it has to be something like AA, right? Like, yes, alcohol addiction is something one can preach about or talk about in public, but you also need a sort of anonymity, a chance to sort of get together and talk with those who suffer from porn together and who might sort of be able to support one another. I often help students find a friend who will set up a password on their computer so they can't look at it anymore. These are the kinds of things that they often want or long for, but they don't know how to set it up. So how do we deal with it? We have to be direct, but I often think one-on-one and small groups are much better than, you know, to sort of just speak about porn from the pulpit, which tends to make everyone uncomfortable.
Okay, Edward responded, having worked with college students for nearly 10 years now, I basically assume all the men I'm working with struggle with porn. So yes, I agree that support groups are needed. It is really addictive. Thank you, Edward. Any other questions? Yeah. We'll just wait one more moment and make sure we don't cut anybody off. Okay, Timothy. Well, I thank you so much for being with us today on behalf of CMA.
Yeah.
And we look forward to hearing more about your suntan in Florida. So you enjoy that. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm covered in sunscreen perpetually.
Okay.
There's no sunscreen.
Let's see. I just got a notice over here from Brent Heckman. Russell Brand put out some videos a couple of years ago on the problem of porn. They're from a secular view, but they are good. Okay. Thank you, Brent. So given that, we appreciate again your time with us today. Thank all of you for joining us on this CCMA webinar. Please remember that we have a webinar coming up in April and in May. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And a recording of this will be available through CCMA should any of you like to participate. All right. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you. And a blessed Easter as it's coming up quickly, and we'll see you all at the next CCMA webinar. Take care.